Hello, my name is Tina Beattie. I'm the director of Catherine of Siena College and Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton. I'm going to be tutoring the final two sessions of this course. This week, we look at the lives of Saints Felicity and Perpetua, two early Christian women martyrs who are still today regarded as among the greatest of saints. Their names are mentioned in the Eucharistic prayers of the Roman Catholic Church, and their feast day is celebrated in the Western Church on the 7th of March. Who were Saints Felicity and Perpetua? Vibia Perpetua was a young married noblewoman, and Felicity, or Felicitas, was a slave. They lived in North Africa at the end of the 1st century. Together with their male companions, Revocatus, Secundulus, and Saturninus, they were catechumens who were being prepared for baptism in the Christian faith, in defiance of a ruling by the Emperor Septimius Severus, which prohibited conversion to Christianity. Roman society was polytheistic insofar as it accommodated worship of many gods, including the god of the Christian faith, providing people also worshipped the emperor, whose godlike status was closely tied to the prosperity of the Roman Empire. It was the refusal of Christians to sacrifice to the emperor that led to their persecution, just as Jews had, in earlier centuries, also been persecuted for refusing to sacrifice to the Roman cults of the gods. Felicity and Perpetua and their companions were arrested, and after refusing to recant, they were condemned to death. Saturus, who was possibly their instructor in the Christian faith, gave himself up voluntarily to be imprisoned and killed with them. Perpetua was breastfeeding her infant son, and her father repeatedly begged her to give in to the Roman authorities for the sake of her family, including her baby boy, but she repeatedly refused, even though she admitted to suffering torments of anguish when separated from her son. Felicity was heavily pregnant and gave birth in prison, handing her newborn daughter over for safekeeping to her sister. They were all martyred at the games held in honour of Emperor Septimius Severus's birthday in the year 203 AD. As North African saints, Felicity and Perpetua are examples of black saints and are often today depicted as such. You might like to pause here and read the Passion of Perpetua and Felicity if you have not already done so. You can find a link to this under Resources in this week's session. If you have a good internet connection, you might also like to watch the video, which gives a helpful account of the lives and deaths of these early martyrs, together with a close illustrated reading of Perpetua's first-person account of their imprisonment. It's a little romanticised and has a slightly Disney-esque feeling to it, and probably rather too evangelical for some, but it is a good way to get into the text of Perpetua's account. The Passion of Saints Perpetua and Felicity is remarkable insofar as it includes an account of the imprisonment and trial of these early Christian martyrs, written in the first person by Perpetua. Scholars are generally agreed that the document is authentic. An editor has added an introduction and what he claims is an eyewitness description of their deaths in the arena, as well as including a first-hand account of a vision by Saturus, who, as I said earlier, was probably the mentor and pastor initiating them into the Christian faith, and who gave himself up voluntarily to be imprisoned and killed alongside them. The editor also adds a moving account of the birth of Felicity's child. In what follows, I read extracts from the modern translation, which is at the top of the list of resources on Moodle. This is a slightly abridged version of Perpetua's account of their imprisonment and the editor's additions, which describe their martyrdom. I've included the full version, a more old-fashioned translation, in a link underneath the modern version in Moodle. I've used various images to illustrate this presentation, and you might like to reflect on your reaction to these images. Some of them are works of art, which represent scenes from Perpetua and Felicity's story. Others are modern images, which are intended to stimulate ideas and help you to engage in different ways with the material. Let's turn now to consider some edited extracts from Perpetua's account. This begins by her describing her determination to resist her father's entreaties, telling him that her Christian identity is as essential to her as that of a jug which cannot be anything other than a jug. She describes his anger and expresses relief that he has left her alone for a few days, and she describes how she and her companions were baptized. We glimpse the horror of her situation by her description of the darkness and heat of the prison, the cruelty of the soldiers, and her torment for the baby boy she'd been breastfeeding and from whom she has been separated. So here she describes how her father visited her in prison and tried to dissuade her from adhering to her newfound faith, out of love for her. "While we were still under arrest," she said, "my father, out of love for me, was trying to persuade me and shake my resolution. 'Father,' said I, 'do you see this vase here, for example, or water pot, or whatever?' 'Yes, I do,' said he. And I told him, could it be called by any other name than what it is? And he said, no. Well, so too I cannot be called anything other than what I am, a Christian.' At this my father was so angered by the word Christian that he moved towards me as though he would pluck my eyes out. But he left it at that and departed, vanquished along with his diabolical arguments. For a few days afterwards I gave thanks to the Lord that I was separated from my father, and I was comforted by his absence. During these few days I was baptized, and I was inspired by the Spirit not to ask for any other favour after the water, but simply the perseverance of the flesh. A few days later we were lodged in the prison, and I was terrified as I had never before been in such a dark hole. What a difficult time it was! With the crowd, the heat was stifling. Then there was the extortion of the soldiers, and to crown it all, I was tortured with worry for my baby there. This short passage gives us insight into a number of issues which raise questions about the significance of gender in this account. As a daughter in a patriarchal culture, Perpetua would have been expected to care for her father in his old age. He clearly loved her, but was driven to fury and despair by her defiance. There's great poignancy in the short reference to her torment about her baby, and it's not hard to imagine how a breastfeeding mother might feel if separated from her baby, but even this is not enough to make Perpetua give in. So, what do you think the media and society would think today if a mother refused to renounce her religion in order to be reunited with her despairing father and her newborn baby? What kind of reactions and emotions do you feel in relation to Perpetua's position? You might like to think about these questions and any other questions that arise for you as you read this account. This next is one of several paragraphs where we get a poignant insight into Perpetua's character and the anxieties she feels. We might ask what this tells us about her spirituality and her faith. Does it differ in any way from conventional hagiographies in its representation of the psychology of female sainthood? So Perpetua describes her joy at being moved to more comfortable surroundings and being briefly reunited with her baby. She writes, "Then Tertius and Pomponius, those blessed deacons who tried to take care of us, bribed the soldiers to allow us to go to a better part of the prison to refresh ourselves for a few hours. Everyone then left that dungeon and shifted for himself. I nursed my baby, who was faint from hunger. In my anxiety, I spoke to my mother about the child. I tried to comfort my brother, and I gave the child in their charge. I was in pain because I saw them suffering out of pity for me. These were the trials I had to endure for many days. Then I got permission for my baby to stay with me in prison. At once I recovered my health, relieved as I was of my worry and anxiety over my child. My prison had suddenly become a palace, so that I wanted to be there rather than anywhere else." This is the point in Perpetua's imprisonment, when she accepts that she will not be released but will suffer martyrdom. She has a vision of Saturus ascending a bronze ladder ahead of her. The ladder is surrounded by weapons with a serpent at its base. This is before Saturus has joined them in prison, so it also foretells his imprisonment and death. And so we read, "And he arrived at the top of the staircase, and he looked back and said to me, 'Perpetua, I am waiting for you, but take care, do not let the dragon bite you.' 'He will not harm me,' I said, 'in the name of Christ Jesus.' Slowly, as though he were afraid of me, the dragon stuck his head out from underneath the ladder. Then, using it as my first step, I trod on his head and went up. Then I saw an immense garden, and in it a grey-haired man sat in shepherd's garb. Tall he was, and milking sheep. And standing around him were many thousands of people clad in white garments. He raised his head, looked at me, and said, 'I am glad you have come, my child.' He called me over to him and gave me, as it were, a mouthful of the milk he was drawing, and I took it into my cupped hands and consumed it. And all those who stood around said, 'Amen.' At the sound of this word I came to with the taste of something sweet in my mouth. I had once told this to my brother, and we realized that we would have to suffer, and that from now on we would no longer have any hope in this life." The imagery of Perpetua's vision here can be puzzling, and if you'd like to know more about its symbolism and possible meanings, you can find a link to Simon Lienoué's essay on the list in the resources this week. Perpetua's father visits her in prison a second time to plead with her to denounce the Christian faith and return home. As you read and reflect on this moving section of the diary, you might consider the following questions. What does this tell us about the changing nature of the relationship between Perpetua and her father? What do we learn from their relationship in terms of the authority figure of the father in relation to the daughter? What can we learn from this about the significance of family relationships in the early church? So we read, "A few days later there was a rumour that we were going to be given a hearing. My father also arrived from the city, worn with worry, and he came to see me with the idea of persuading me. 'Daughter,' he said, 'have pity on my grey head, have pity on me, your father. If I deserve to be called your father, if I have favoured you above all your brothers, if I have raised you to reach this prime of your life, do not abandon me to the reproach of men. Think of your brothers, think of your mother and your aunt, think of your child who will not be able to live once you are gone. Give up your pride. You will destroy all of us. None of us will ever be able to speak freely again if anything happens to you.' This was the way my father spoke out of love for me, kissing my hands and throwing himself down before me. With tears in his eyes, he no longer addressed me as his daughter, but as a woman. I was sorry for my father's sake, because he alone of all my kin would be unhappy to see me suffer. I tried to comfort him, saying, 'It will all happen in the prisoner's dock as God wills, for you may be sure that we are not left to ourselves, but we are all in his power.' And he left me in great sorrow." Perpetua's father visits her a third time when she's before the tribunal awaiting sentence, begging her to make the sacrifice to the emperor and return home for the sake of her son. Again, you might reflect on some questions this section of the diary raises. What do we learn about Perpetua's character from this extract? What can we discover about the attitude of the Roman official, Hilarianus? Do you think he wanted to persecute Perpetua? How credible do you think her dilemma is to modern readers? So we read, "Then when it came my turn, my father appeared with my son, dragged me from the step, and said, 'Perform the sacrifice, have pity on your baby.' Hilarianus the governor, who had received his judicial powers as the successor of the late proconsul Minucius Timianus, said to me, "Have pity on your father's grey head, have pity on your infant son, offer the sacrifice for the welfare of the emperors." "I will not," I retorted. "Are you a Christian?" said Hilarianus. And I said, "Yes, I am." When my father persisted in trying to dissuade me, Hilarianus ordered him to be thrown to the ground and beaten with a rod. I felt sorry for my father, just as if I myself had been beaten. I felt sorry for his pathetic old age. Then Hilarianus passed sentence on all of us. We were condemned to the beasts, and we returned to prison in high spirits. But my baby had got used to being nursed at the breast and to staying with me in prison. So I sent the deacon Pomponius straight away to my father to ask for the baby. But my father refused to give him over. But as God willed, the baby had no further desire for the breast, nor did I suffer any inflammation, and so I was relieved of any anxiety for my child and of any discomfort in my breasts. Just so that you know, the version we're using here omits an account of a dream Perpetua had, which inspired her to pray for her brother Dinocrates, who had died as a young child. If you want to read this account, you'll find a link in the list of resources to the full version of the text. We're now jumping ahead a bit and leaving out that section. Perpetua's father visits her one final time before the games, when she's to be sent into the arena with the wild beasts. And she writes, "Now the day of the contest was approaching, and my father came to see me overwhelmed with sorrow. He started tearing the hairs from his beard and threw them on the ground. He then threw himself on the ground and began to curse his old age and to say such words as would move all creation. I felt sorry for his unhappy old age." This next scene is puzzling in some aspects, but it's very interesting in its representation of gender. Perpetua describes a vision she has of being naked and of being confronted by an Egyptian in the arena and of becoming a man to fight against him. What does this description of Perpetua's dream say to you, and how would you interpret it? Is there anything you find particularly striking or puzzling about this vision? So she writes, "I looked at the enormous crowd who watched in astonishment. I was surprised that no beasts were let loose on me, for I knew that I was condemned to die by the beasts. Then out came an Egyptian against me of vicious appearance, together with his seconds, to fight with me. There also came up to me some handsome young men to be my seconds and assistants. My clothes were stripped off, and suddenly I was a man. My seconds began to rub me down with oil, as they are wont to do before a contest. Then I saw the Egyptian on the other side rolling in the dust. Next there came forth a man of marvellous stature, such that he rose above the top of the amphitheatre. He was clad in a beltless purple tunic with 2 stripes, one on either side, running down the middle of his chest. He wore sandals that were wondrously made of gold and silver, and he carried a wand like an athletic trainer, and a green branch on which there were golden apples. And he asked for silence, and said, if this Egyptian defeats her, he will slay her with the sword, but if she defeats him, she will receive this branch." Then he withdrew. We drew close to one another and began to let our fists fly. My opponent tried to get hold of my feet, but I kept striking him in the face with the heels of my feet. Then I was raised up into the air, and I began to pummel him without, as it were, touching the ground. Then when I noticed there was a lull, I put my 2 hands together, linking the fingers of one hand with those of the other, and thus I got hold of his head. He fell flat on his face, and I stepped on his head. The crowd began to shout, and my assistant started to sing psalms. Then I walked up to the trainer and took the branch. He kissed me and said to me, "Peace be with you, my daughter." I began to walk in triumph towards the gate of life. Then I awoke. I realized that it was not with wild animals that I would fight, but with the devil. But I knew that I would win the victory. So much for what I did up until the eve of the contest. About what happened at the contest itself, let him write of it who will. At this point, the editor takes over the story. We omit here an account of Saturus's vision and go to the account of Felicity giving birth. This is a rare example of an account which gives some sense of being written directly from observation of a woman's bodily reality. You might like to reflect on the significance of this account of childbirth, bearing in mind that it's told in the third person and we're no longer reading Perpetua's first-hand account. What do you find most interesting about this description? How does it conform to or challenge contemporary Christian accounts of childbirth and motherhood? Can you think of any other questions or insights it raises for you? So we read, As for Felicitas, she too enjoyed the Lord's favour in this wise. She had been pregnant when she was arrested and was now in her 8th month. As the day of the spectacle drew near, she was very distressed that her martyrdom would be postponed because of her pregnancy, for it's against the law for women with child to be executed. Thus she might have to shed her holy innocent blood afterwards, along with others who were common criminals. Her comrades in martyrdom were also saddened, for they were afraid that they would have to leave behind so fine a companion to travel alone on the same road to hope. And so, 2 days before the contest, they poured forth a prayer to the Lord in one torrent of common grief, and immediately after their prayer the birth pains came upon her. She suffered a good deal in her labour because of the natural difficulty of an 8 months' delivery. Hence one of the assistants of the prison guard said to her, You suffer so much now, what will you do when you're tossed to the beasts? Little did you think of that when you refused to sacrifice. What I am suffering now, she replied, I suffer by myself, but then another will be inside me who will suffer for me, just as I shall be suffering for him. And she gave birth to a girl, and one of the sisters brought her up as her own daughter. There follows a lengthy and harrowing account of the ways in which these martyrs died in the arena, killed by beasts or put to death by the sword. Please read this for yourself and reflect on your reaction. Here we consider extracts from that description. The day of their victory dawned, and they marched from the prison to the amphitheatre joyfully, as though they were going to heaven, with calm faces, trembling if at all, with joy rather than fear. Perpetua went along with shining countenance and calm step, as the beloved of God, as a wife of Christ, putting down everyone's stare by her own intense gaze. With them also was Felicitas, glad that she had safely given birth, so that now she could fight the beasts, going from one bloodbath to another, from the midwife to the gladiator, ready to wash after childbirth in a second baptism. They were then led up to the gates, and the men were forced to put on the robes of priests of Saturn, the women the dress of the priestesses of Ceres. But the noble Perpetua strenuously resisted this to the end. We came to this of our own free will, that our freedom should not be violated. We agreed to pledge our lives, provided that we would do no such thing. You agreed with us to do this. Even injustice recognized justice. The military tribune agreed. They were to be brought into the arena just as they were. The imagery in these extracts is startling. Phrases such as from the midwife to the gladiator suggest a potent relationship between the blood of childbirth and the blood of martyrdom. Perpetua boldly defends the freedom not to wear the robes of the Roman priestesses, and the narrator observes that even injustice recognized justice. There's much to reflect on here about the nature of freedom, the nature of persecution, and the relationship between justice and injustice. Please post any questions or comments in the discussion forum. Again, this next extract suggests that there was a gendered dimension to martyrdom, and the raw account here reveals the extent to which sexual humiliation was part of the torment. It also tells us of the power of the maternal body to command respect, even in a situation of torture and violent death. The touching account of Perpetua fastening her hair is a poignant description of the small gestures and acts by way of which she asserted her will, and it gives us another insight into her character. So we read, "For the young women, however, the devil had prepared a mad heifer. This was an unusual animal, but it was chosen that their sex might be matched with that of the beast. So they were stripped naked, placed in nets, and thus brought out into the arena. Even the crowd was horrified when they saw that one was a delicate young girl, and the other was a woman fresh from childbirth, with the milk still dripping from her breasts. And so they were brought back again and dressed in unbelted tunics. First the heifer tossed Perpetua, and she fell on her back. Then, sitting up, she pulled down the tunic that was ripped along the side, so that it covered her thighs, thinking more of her modesty than of her pain. Next she asked for a pin to fasten her untidy hair, for it was not right that a martyr should die with her hair in disorder, lest she might seem to be mourning in her hour of triumph." We read now about the death of Perpetua. Perpetua, however, had yet to taste more pain. She screamed as she was struck on the bone. Then she took the trembling hand of the young gladiator and guided it to her throat. It was as though so great a woman, feared as she was by the unclean spirit, could not be dispatched unless she herself were willing. That's where we end the story of Perpetua and Felicity. Today there are many accounts of people who are tortured and killed because of their beliefs. Many Christians, but people from all religions and convictions, which inspire them to stand up to tyranny and fight for justice. Can you think of any stories you've read or perhaps even experienced in your own cultural or political context? How relevant do you think the story of early Christian martyrdom is to our own times? You might like to read the newspapers and just try to find out about martyrdom today. What does this story tell us about the significance of gender in the early church? And finally, from your experience of observing or participating in a Christian culture, how far do you think the representation of womanhood in this account reflects modern Christian attitudes towards maternal femininity? To conclude, please spend some time looking at these images of Felicity and Perpetua and consider what they tell us about the politics of representation in terms of race, culture, class, and gender. The story of Felicity and Perpetua is an account of Christianity as a faith of resistance, struggle, and martyrdom in the face of a society's gods and objects of worship. How do these images suggest the ways in which cultures domesticate Christianity to reflect rather than challenge their values? What do you think are the gods of modern society, and how might people of faith feel called to resist and challenge these? We close with this exercise. I hope you've enjoyed this week's session, although maybe enjoyment is the wrong word. We've been dealing with some rather harrowing stuff. Next week, I'll be back to look at Catherine of Siena, one of the greatest saints of the medieval church. Until then, goodbye.